And in this talk, I will review the main Oregon WPA projects that, and provide an example of each that relates to Timberline. And then I'll describe the construction, furnishing, and decoration of the lodge as an outstanding example of the WPA. There were two key developments that fed into increased interest in a lodge on Mount Hood in the 1920s: recreation and accessibility. The Forest Service had commissioned nationally known landscape architect Frank Waugh to draft a report on recreational uses in the Mount Hood National Forest. This 1920 document motivated the Forest Service to set aside areas where logging was secondary to recreational pursuits. The policy represented a shift from the economic interests toward multiple use philosophy in the forests, and the area around Timberline was designated earmarked for recreation. The Mount Hood Loop Road encircling Mount Hood had been finished in 1925, and increased accessibility gave rise to such groups as the Portland Winter Sports Association, which began to plan ski competitions in the area around Government Camp. Some entrepreneurs proposed building a lodge on the north side of the mountain in the 1920s, and one suggestion was for a multi-storied building that would have been far more appropriate to downtown Portland than the mountain, and that proposal also included a tram that would have gone to the summit of Mount Hood. Then the Depression hit, and funding was no longer available. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office as president in 1933 and immediately put into effect the Civilian Conservation Corps to begin addressing widespread unemployment. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, followed soon after. It was established on May 6, 1935 through the Emergency Relief Appropriations Act, which authorized the Roosevelt administration to spend $4.88 billion to help the unemployed. Griffith was appointed Oregon's administrator for the WPA, and in September, just a few months after he was appointed, he applied for funds to build a ski lodge on Mount Hood. In December, $246,893 was allocated for the lodge. In Oregon, WPA Project 1101, pictured there, stands out as the most visible symbol of the WPA. It was constructed, furnished, and decorated under the project. In addition to direct relief, projects like Timberline provided employment to private contractors and others. On Timberline, for example, unskilled WPA workers were supervised by a private contractor, Lorenz Brothers General Contractors. Another benefit to the economy was that workers employed under WPA projects were then able to purchase goods and services that they could not afford earlier. These two charts are almost impossible to read even close up, but I wanted to use them as examples. The largest number of relief workers in Oregon was in Portland, where a total of 5,000 were employed on engineering, construction, cultural, and service projects. The two bar graphs provide statistics for different projects in the state in 1939. The first chart shows that the largest number of workers, up to 18,000, were employed in road building and construction. That's the second bar graph there. Every other division employed less than 2,000 people at any given time. The second chart illustrates that the largest WPA expenditures were for highway and road construction. So that's that long second, again, the second bar. Every project, well, I should say two, federal one, which was the cultural programs, is right here, the fourth from the bottom. And yet that's what we think of so often now with the WPA are the cultural programs. Every project required a contribution from a local sponsor. The white portion of each bar on that second chart, it's not very visible, but it's a small section, indicates the sponsor contribution for that project. The sponsor contribution for Timberline was $8,620 provided by the Forest Service that improved the road from Government Camp to Phlox Point and built the last segment, the last half mile to the lodge site. That was supposed to be about there was also supposed to be an additional $20,000 provided by the Mount Hood Development Association, which was a group of private businessmen that had kind of gathered, organized to help promote a lodge on the mountain. And they raised money that was actually used to pay the consulting architect, Gilbert, Stanley, Underwood. So, Oregon's largest WPA projects. In Portland, among the earliest use of WPA funds was to improve city parks and municipal golf courses. Rocky Butte and Portland Municipal Airport were major WPA construction projects in Oregon. For the airport, a bond issue had allowed the city to purchase land and the WPA provided $1.3 million to prepare it for construction. Workers covered the site with 4 million cubic yards of sand dredged from the Columbia River, and most of that work was done by hand. Roads built under WPA funding included construction of Wolf Creek and Wilson River highways, and these roads provided improved access to the coast and opened up economic opportunities to coastal communities. The dedication of the highway on June 30th and July 1st included Oregon's WPA administrator, Emerson J. Griffith, Scotch Broom Queen June Callahan, and then Governor Charles Sprague. A theme of the road dedication was the link between the coast and Timberline Lodge. The slogan on the banner was, "Mount Hood awaits you." WPA projects linked communities together across the region. In Oregon, as elsewhere, WPA service projects were largely relegated to the women's division based on the concept that engineering and construction projects were for men. Professional and business-trained women resented the initial assignment of all classifications of women on work relief to sewing rooms. Most of the workers on the WPA were men because only one family member was eligible for work relief. And logically, this was considered to be the man in the family. Women on relief were generally unmarried, widowed, or divorced. Nationally, 51% of women on work relief engaged in sewing, 41% in other services such as housekeeping and household services, or preparing hot lunches. 78% of the women on the WPA in Oregon were employed as seamstresses. A textile workshop was set up in a downtown Portland building that was owned by a fraternal organization so that they could make textiles for Timberline, such as this workroom was the one on the right. These women were sewing applique draperies for Timberline guest rooms. Well, an interesting and unusual WPA project in Oregon is illustrated here. It was an effort to reinvigorate Oregon's flagging flax industry. Hand-woven upholstery and placemats for Timberline were intended to be made from Oregon flax to promote its use. Commercially available materials may have been cheaper in the long run, and may have actually been used in the long run. Similarly, an early attempt to have workers in the Clackamas County hand hew shakes for the roof was abandoned because workers failed to show up at the work site and because it was found to be cheaper to purchase manufactured shakes. 5 arts projects, collectively known as Federal One, were included under the WPA: the Federal Writers Project, the Historical Records Survey, Federal Music Project, Federal Theater Project, and the Federal Art Project. Alfred Powers was the head of the Writers Project in Oregon from 1935 to October 1937, when T.J. Edwards took over. Oregon publications under the Writers Project included Oregon End of the Trail, 1940, was essentially the Blue Book. I have a copy here if any of you are interested to take a look at it. Mount Hood, a Guide, also published in 1940. And there was another publication, Oregon Oddities, which was a magazine used for in public schools. Writers also collected oral histories and folklore. Writers were sent out with questionnaires to collect folklore from Oregon communities. 81 life stories from interviews of Oregonians are available online at the Library of Congress website. Supervisor Claire Warner Churchill, pictured on the left, wrote a limited edition book with color plates about Timberline. It's a beautiful book. It's very rare. The Writers Project also produced The Builders of Timberline, and there's a radio script in the Oregon State Library about Timberline. We sort of passed this book around. This is one edition of The Builders of Timberline, which you're welcome to take a look at. Originally part of the Writers Project, the Historical Records Survey was devoted to surveying and indexing historically significant records in state, county, and local archives. The official mission statement was discovery, preservation, and listing of basic materials for research in the history of the United States. This was around in all the states. The survey developed the inventory of county archives in Oregon, illustrated here, and completed at least 14 descriptive guides to records in many of the county courthouses. Each of the guides included an overview of county history based upon the review of the archives. Working also almost in tandem with WPA were drafters, historians, and photographers engaged in the Historic American Buildings Survey, and they compiled information including measured drawings on nearly 100 significant structures in the state of Oregon. Bess Whitcomb was the director of the Theater Project in Oregon. Productions in Portland included some plays that focused on social issues, such as Power, about electrification and ownership of public utilities, and 1/3 of a Nation, which dealt with the problem of housing. The Federal Theater Project performed dances at the dedication of Timberline Lodge. The image on the left may illustrate the flax scutching machines. Indian celebration dance may be the dance on the right. These images are stills from from a video, and I apologize for the quality. Among other theater projects that focused on Timberline was Timberline Tintypes. Nationally, the Theater Project came under congressional scrutiny and was accused of being infiltrated by communists. Congressional proclamation ended the Theater Project in June 1939. Free concerts were provided in Portland public parks, performed by professional musicians in a 48-piece band under Frederick Goodrich or a 27-piece orchestra under Harry Linden through the Federal Music Project. The impact of the Music Project was limited in Oregon, however, because performances were largely confined to the Portland area. The Portland Symphonic Band, WPA band, performed at the dedication of Timberline, as you can see illustrated on the right. The Federal Art Project was the fifth of the Federal One projects. Music, sculptures, there were 18 sculptors who were employed under the project in Oregon. Posters and other graphic arts were produced under the Federal Art Project in Oregon. The Timberline Lodge poster on the right is kind of an anomaly in a way because those posters were actually made by the Illinois Art Project and sent to Oregon to use. Every one of the poster, and there are a number of different designs, has the words, Timberline, a mile-high playground for everyone. The Art Project reached out to rural communities through art centers created as joint projects with local involvement. The centers offered free art classes to children and adults, exhibitions, art libraries, studio facilities, and musical, theater, and dance performances. In Oregon, art centers were established at Gold Beach in Curry County, in Salem, and at La Grande. The Curry County Art Center, illustrated here, was the smallest in the country. Excuse me. The Oregon Ceramic Studio grew out of a kiln that was built through the WPA. It was then the largest kiln on the West Coast. The exhibition poster and the example of a ceramic were from an early exhibition at the studio. Later, textile weavers and designers were added to the ceramic studio, and the studio itself was led for many years by Lydia Herrick Lodge. It was the oldest continuously running craft institution in the United States. It moved down to the North Park Blocks area and was called the Museum for Contemporary Craft, and sadly it has just recently closed altogether. There was an emphasis on folk heroes in craft projects, including at Timberline. And here there were no ceramics actually produced for the lodge, although there are 3 up there, unrelated to Paul Bunyan and unrelated to the lodge. They were produced by a man named Greek Key, who did a number of beautiful ceramics under the WPA. 2 of them are pomegranates and 1 is a fish. But the Paul Bunyan figure was featured at Timberline through Virginia Darcy's Opus Sectile Glass Murals in the Blue Ox Bar. And E.J. Griffith had hoped to plan a Paul Bunyan festival in conjunction with the Federal Theater Project before it closed. Let's look at Timberline Lodge construction in more detail. So after the WPA funds of $246,893 were made available, the local Forest Service asked the National Office for a recommendation of a nationally recognized architect. There may have been some question who actually requested the recommendation. But anyway, Gilbert Stanley Underwood was hired as the consulting architect by January 31st of 1936. And remember, the funds were just made available in mid to late December of 35. Underwood had designed lodges in the national parks. Bryce Canyon and Ahwahnee in Yosemite are 2 still in existence. In these lodges, he followed a rustic style in the tradition of arts and crafts, using local materials in nature of wood and stone that blended in with the surrounding environment. For Timberline, Underwood proposed a similarly themed design using an octagonal head house with uneven wings extending out from it. He advised on lodge decoration, suggesting crude details and an avoidance of sophistication and a tendency to over-design. The lodges had actually ended up and moved away from his tenets for lack of sophistication and really, I think, made it more beautiful. The drawings pictured here were published in the newspaper in February of 1936 to promote the site. The sale of bonds by these businessmen I mentioned, the Mount Hood Development Association. This is the site as Underwood proposed it, facing north, and the top one facing south. Tim Turner was the lead architect for the Forest Service at the time and familiar with conditions on Mount Hood, the winter snow, for example, and he was the one who recommended orienting the building the other direction, south. The Forest Service architects, and there were 4 at that time, recommended changing the head house shape of an octagon to a hexagon, and that meant that the wings were extending out at an angle of about 120 degrees so that all the rooms have views south and or north. Locally, Timberline's style is called Cascadian. This term may have also originated from Forest Service architect Tim Turner. I'm nearly sure that it did. I first saw him use it in an article in the Oregonian where he described the lodge as Cascadian architecture. The term Cascadian in current usage seems to refer to Northwest architecture that is formed around a central head house, similar to Timberline's. The name Timberline Lodge was designated by Forest Service in a memo from the regional forester, C.F. Shirley Buck, sent on February 4th, 1936, though many continue to refer to the building as the Mount Hood Hotel through the construction. The Forest Service architects, besides Tim Turner, included Lynn Forrest, Howard Gifford, and Dean Wright. Lynn Forrest was the draftsman who drew that drawing of the lodge, pretty much as it was constructed. The allocation of the sponsor, the Forest Service, was used to improve the road from Government Camp and to build this half-mile segment to the lodge site. The clearing of the road started on March 6th. This was some of the most difficult work in the entire project. The Forest Service employee in charge of this was named Captain Jones, otherwise known as Hurry Up Jones. He used a power shovel specially brought for this project. The spring storms were so severe that often a day's work was obliterated by a night's snow. The snow was so densely packed that blasting was also used. The work continued because there was a terrific rush to spend the allocation before federal funding ran out. In late spring, Griffith became concerned that the site was too close to the Salmon River Canyon, where snow cornices built up, and he requested that the site be moved. So a survey party of some Forest Service personnel was sent up, among them the engineer Ward Gano. This was in May 7th and 8th of 1936, and they were to survey through the snow. There were about 14 feet of snow in many places that they were surveying through, and then they confirmed that it would be fine to move the site 200 yards to the west. In addition to moving the site, Griffith influenced the lodge design in several other ways. The design had proposed small mullioned panes for the windows, the view window that faces the Mount Jefferson side to the south, and also to the north, the Mount Hood facing window. Griffith requested that there be large panes put in there. The Forest Service architects and Gilbert, Stanley, Underwood didn't agree with this, and so Griffith brought up Portland architect Morris Whitehouse to say that there would be no harm to the architectural appearance of the building if large panes were used, and that's why they changed from the small mullioned panes. In addition, he requested that there be a reflecting pond on the north side of the lodge, and that is still there. And he did not approve of a public bathroom on the first floor. There's the ground floor where there are public bathrooms, and then the first floor, which is where guests traditionally had checked into the lodge. There had been construction, fixtures had been put in for a public bathroom on that floor, and he said that there shouldn't be a public bathroom on that floor, so they were taken out. The camp at Summit Meadows had been established as a CCC camp, and it was adapted for use by WPA workers during the summer of 1936. It had a capacity for 450 men. The workers were trucked 7 miles up to the site daily. Workers were supervised by private contractors, and their wages were between 55 cents per hour for unskilled workers and 90 cents per hour for skilled. They paid $1 a day for room and board. Their chef was a Swiss-trained chef, Albert Aldorfer. He was also an amateur photographer, took many photographs of construction and the lodge. And he said that they prepared in that camp 3 meals a day. So they were busy. Workers wore no protective gear, no helmets, frequently no gloves, and there were no major injuries and almost no labor disputes, almost. Clearing the road, clearing the snow and building the road was completed by June 11th, and the groundbreaking was scheduled for June 14th to coincide with the Golden Rose ski race. That's pictured on your upper left. Construction began with the wings, and the head house was put in between. Ward Gano was in charge of excavating and setting the concrete forms. All of this work was completed within a month. And The concrete footings and walls for the head house were completed within 2 months, by the middle of August. The east wing was a little slower to be built than the west wing, probably because there was a basement. They had to excavate for a basement for the utilities to be put in. The columns and balcony timbers and the roof trusses were in the head house were erected by October 10th. Here, 6 enormous ponderosa pine columns protected by wood sheathing were erected with the use of gin poles. The columns had been hand cut with broadaxe and foot adze by a cabin builder in the rhododendron area, Henry Steiner, who charged $25 for each column, provided that the WPA labor would move and turn the logs. As Ward Gano remembered, Steiner completed the work in 2 weeks. WPA Administrator Harry Hopkins came to visit the construction site on September 14, 1936. The papers reported he threw a snowball. There had been a slightly unseasonable snow storm before he arrived, and that they also reported he was pleased with the project. In his thank you note to the Forest Service, he wrote, "We have built lodges in the national parks, but nothing like this." Timberline, however, did cause some concern among WPA administrators because it did not meet the requirements of a typical WPA project. 90% of the costs were to be labor and 10% materials. Timberline's material costs were much higher, as much as 40%. Most of the labor was to be for unskilled workers, but Timberline required many more skilled workers. The hours were to be about 30 per week per worker. Again, exceptions were made for the Timberline project to get the building framed in before the winter snows. Ward Gano remembered with relief when approval came to add Saturdays to the work week. Workers were shifted every 2 weeks, and as far as I know, that occurred. No more than 10% of the labor force was to be non-WPA, but that was changed to about 25%, again because of the unusual demands of this project. An impression existed in the administration of a ski lodge being elitist. A journalist called it Uncle Sam's Sun Valley. And repeated applications brought the final cost to over $1 million. Through the fall, stonemasons worked on stone facing and a 500-ton stone chimney in the main lobby using andesite stone collected locally. Many of the stonemasons were Italian immigrants who had learned their skill in Italy. The same men worked on a number of other sites, including tunnels in Portland and stonework at Rocky Butte. Ira Davidson was supervisor of the stonemasons, and he's pictured on the left. In the late summer and fall, the engineer, Ward Gano, was concentrating on locating an adequate water source. That first year, they provided water through a spring and a gravity-fed system that was adequate and temporarily solved the problem, but eventually they had to tap a spring below the lodge and install a pump to bring the water up to the lodge level. Early in October, it became apparent that the plans for the sewage disposal system were completely inadequate, and no plans at all had been made for the location of a septic tank or a drainage field. So on site, Ward Gano designed a system that remained in place until 1960. Local architect John Yon remembered advising Griffith that the interior needed a woman's touch. Yon recommended Marjorie Hoffman Smith for the job. Smith grew up in Portland, steeped in the arts, and became a professional interior designer. She was the assistant art administrator for the state and devoted her attention to the furnishing of Timberline Lodge. She once wrote, "There is a spirit in objects made by loving hands." Smith and Griffith, pictured here on the left, collaborated on the arts and furnishings. They're standing with a St. Bernard, one of the early mascots of the lodge. Architect Underwood had set design themes of pioneer and Indian. And those two themes, plus wildlife, were the three themes that Marjorie Hoffman Smith took. She varied the expression so that the lodge decor was integrated and contemporary. In addition to directing the furnishings project, Smith worked with the regional art directors, pictured on the right, and commissioned art at the lodge. The art and furnishings were funded through the Federal Art Project. We're going to look at several slides that showed examples of the three decorative themes here. The pioneer theme is integral to the design of the head house. Beams extend out from the stone chimney like a wagon wheel with decorative iron strapping. The mezzanine railing and rail on the floor of the main lobby resemble corrals. The wrought iron lamps have triangular bases shaped like branding irons and similarly shaped ashtrays, which are then removed from the lodge. The same wagon wheel effect characterizes the ceiling in the lower lobby. Another feature of the interior is the curved arch called the Timberline Arch, but with its resemblance to a haystack, it's also a nod to pioneer architecture. It was repeated throughout the building in doorways, and when she began on the project, Smith took this already designed architectural element and used it in the furniture, such as in the backs of these dining room chairs, which are now on the mezzanine. She later said she was not happy with the design, but that the best thing to do with a design that you don't like is to repeat it. And from that repetition, you gain a rhythm and a pattern that the single design doesn't possess. The second design theme was Indian. Indian symbols were not drawn from local Native American designs, with the possible exception of pictographs or petroglyph type sandblasting carvings that are in the main chimney, but were inspired instead by the year-end moons in the Campfire Girl Handbook, which was owned by Forest Service architect Howard Gifford's daughter. This chart is a takeoff on the year-end moons from the Campfire Girl Handbook. The two columns on each side are, when they were put together, were used in the handbook for many years. And the symbols in the middle are also used at the lodge, but were not found on that year-end moons. So these designs that were in the Campfire Girl Handbook appear on lintels in the lower level, on the dining room bay windows as pictured here, and most impressively on the weather vane, which is the wild goose moon, the symbol for April. Wildlife was the third theme used in design at the lodge. Fauna and flora of the Alpine region appeared in wood, print, and mosaic. Tom Lehman's Spring on the Mountain, a mosaic pictured around the drinking fountain, is pictured up on the right. Animal newel posts, such as the bear newel post, carved by Ray Newfer, who was supervisor of the wood shop, and wood marquetry, such as the coyotes, which was made by Amy Gorham and is in the main lobby. The newel posts were made from recycled telephone poles, which were purchased in Portland for $2.10 each. The Botanical was painted by Martina Gangle. There are over 150 botanicals, all of flora in the Alpine area. Many of them are hand-colored lithographs, and some are original watercolors. This one is of mountain ash. Martina Gangle also did other paintings, such as a large painting that's still at Rose City School in Portland. There was also a set of wildflower, similarly done watercolors done down at Curry County. There's a set at the Multnomah County Library of those. And there are some duplicates of the botanicals that are up at Timberline that are at the Oregon State Library too, and elsewhere. Paintings commissioned for the lodge followed similar mountain themes to the pioneer wildlife and Indian designs. Among the first artists commissioned under the Federal Art Project for the Timberline Project was Darrell Austin, who created 5 paintings in a series of mountain activities to hang at Timberline. We will see another series of works based on mountain activities in the linoleum panels in the Barlow Room. Originally, however, only 2 of these paintings hung at the lodge, and the 3 remaining paintings were sent to other places, Portland Public Schools, Tongue Point Naval Station, and the Portland Art Museum. But all 3 have now been loaned back to the lodge, and they're all hanging on the mezzanine where they were originally intended to be. Another early commission was given to Portland artist Charles Heyman, who was asked to paint this oil depicting a mountain. The mountain is one of his 2 largest paintings. He painted many smaller works through his life. And the other one, Mountains, was completed the following year and is in the collection at the Portland Art Museum. Heyman completed 64 paintings and 9 woodcut additions under the Federal Art Project. He was able to paint this painting and Mountains because the Art Project provided the materials, things he couldn't afford on his own, and also paid for his time. Before the Depression, he worked as an engraver, and he always made prints and painted, but through the Depression, he was able to visualize his life as an artist. He always lived very frugally, but he was able to support himself as an artist, something he hadn't imagined that would be possible before the New Deal. And this was the case with many artists who, under the Federal Art Project. This is one of my very favorite paintings, Huckleberry Pickers by C.S. Price. Like Heyman, Price was able to paint larger, significant works because materials were provided to him. Huckleberry Pickers, pictured here, and its companion piece, Pack Train, are his 2 largest and perhaps most significant paintings. Price may be classified as a regionalist who painted an early version of the American scene. He also painted haunting, expressionistic works. These murals were intended for the Cascade dining room, and there are photographs showing them hanging there, but they were rejected and sent back to Portland. For a short time, they were in a men's service center, and then the Pack Train went to Portland Auditorium, Huckleberry Pickers went to the Art Museum, and a janitor rescued Pack Train and in the furnace room. And it was sent to the Art Museum and then returned on loan to Timberline after the C.S. Price wing was built in 1975. So that's where they hang now. So what was put in the place of the C.S. Price murals in the Cascade dining room? This mural and its companion, symbolizing the lodge builder's metal and symbolizing lodge builder's wood. These were painted by Howard Sewell, and for years they were on either side of the doorway to the Cascade dining room. But since they were restored in the 1970s, they've been hanging on the mezzanine. Instead of Price's rich, blocky forms, Sewell's murals feature stylized, heavily outlined figures, apparently ancient Egyptian workers who flank the WPA metalworker. Sewell's use of images from ancient times has the effect of idealizing the common worker. Labor was a theme that appeared often in WPA-era paintings. The angularity and division of space suggests architectural forms and brings to mind Egyptian motifs used in Art Deco design. Art Deco is not commonly used to describe Timberline. Arts and crafts is much more common. But there are definitely Art Deco elements at the lodge in the design, and it's fun to kind of pick them out. Sewell also painted panels in the Oregon City High School and elsewhere, and he taught at the Salem Art Center during the New Deal. While large public areas were decorated with art from a variety of artists, the smaller Blue Ox Bar and the Ski Grill were each devoted to the work of a single artist. Douglas Lynch, the second artist after Darrell Austin, was assigned the topic of mountain activities for a series of works at the lodge. He designed carved and glazed linoleum panels in 1938 after the lodge was open to the public. He called the series The Calendar of Mountain Sports. The murals include skiing, snowshoeing, tobogganing, photography, fly fishing, which was Doug Lynch's favorite activity, walking, horseback riding, dancing, camping, and sketching. Lynch also painted oil on plaster scenes above two arched doorways in the what was then the ski grill. The three Lynch murals on the east wall had a difficult history. After years of being scrubbed clean, they were removed when cafeteria equipment was installed in the 1960s. Stored in the attic under mattresses, they lay forgotten for over 20 years. When found, they were chipped, cracked, and soiled, and their glazing had faded. Lynch requested that during restoration, the glaze be left unrepaired, and so they remain. The richness of the mural on the left, photographed when it first completed, contrasts sharply with its cracked survivor. Lynch, who died in 2009, was one of the last surviving original artists who worked on Timberline. The photo on the left shows the ski grill in 1938 with the painted arch doorway and the heavy tables and chairs, which are still in use in the mezzanine. The carved bar stools have been missing for many years. The Indian canoe light fixtures are still in place. The ski grill was reconfigured into a multi-purpose room and audiovisual facilities in 1986, and it's now called the Barlow Room. The cubby hole that became the Blue Ox Bar was originally designed for wood storage, but in 1938, plans changed, and interior designer Marjorie Hoffman Smith, who insisted that the lodge must have a bar, wasn't that long after Prohibition was abolished, commissioned artist Virginia Darcy to decorate a small bar. Darcy decided to make opus sectile glass murals, illustrating the story, as I'd mentioned, of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox in this narrow space. She made full-size tempera drawings that hung in the lodge until the glass murals were completed. The postcard on the left shows how these drawings were hung when the lodge first opened. Darcy felt very fortunate to return to Timberline in 1976 to restore the murals, and has been again restored one more time. Under the Federal Art Project, Darcy also painted murals at the Oregon City Library. Unfortunately, they've been painted over. So we've talked about design, construction, and decorative themes and art. Let's turn to textiles, metal, and wood craft. Smith was closely involved with the textile project to provide draperies, rugs, and bedspreads for the lodge. Textile projects were completed through the Women's and Professional Project under the WPA. There were over 20 unique designs for the guest rooms based on one of the three decorative themes: Pioneer, the covered wagon rug, as you see there, Wildlife, the Solomon Seal Room, illustrated with that page from one of the design books. This room was used by Eleanor Roosevelt when the lodge was dedicated. Or Indian. There was a room that was called Indian Woman Walking Her Dog. Each had specially coordinated applique draperies, hand-hooked rugs, and woven bedspreads. The women in the lower left are hooking rugs for Timberline. Lower right, excuse me. Most textiles in the lodge are not original any longer. A few examples are on exhibit in the lower lobby, such as that covered wagon rug. And some recreated textiles are in the lodge, and these are woven draperies in the main, in the public areas, the main lobby, the Cascade dining room, and the mezzanine. Also, there are applique draperies in the guest rooms that are recreated from original designs. Smith worked with Orion Benjamin Dawson, supervisor of the WPA metal shop, to design metal hardware, lamps, light fixtures, and wrought iron gates to the dining room and andirons. Many of the blacksmiths in the shop were older. 65 was not an uncommon age for them. And they were thrilled to have an opportunity to use their skills for something other than shoeing horses. The older blacksmith in the upper right was Ed Frisk, whom Dawson credited with making the hardware, including the ram's head door knocker for the enormous front door. Dawson remembered the rush to complete the Coyote Den gates and major light fixtures in time for the dedication of the lodge by Roosevelt. He also made the wrought iron gates for the University of Oregon and Oregon State University under the Federal Art Project in his workshop on Boise Street in Portland. I would like to mention the one way that Timberline has been able to carry forward an idea that was part of the WPA, which was that there would be a continuation, a revival of craft industry. This hasn't happened universally, of course, as we know, but it has happened at Timberline to a certain extent, partly through the Friends of Timberline and some of the restoration projects. The gentleman on the left is Russell Moggins. He was an Eastern Airline pilot, and when he retired, he was an hobbyist blacksmith, and he began making, first he started with fireplace pokers, many of which were missing from the lodge, all in the style of the original. And it became like a second profession for him. And he learned from Obie Dawson, and then at the end of the 1970s, Obie Dawson died. Russell Moggins continued on, and then he met one of the young Northwest blacksmiths, Darrell Nelson, and Darrell remembers that Russell told him, "You must come up to the lodge. I've really got to show you this place." And Darrell has continued to make hand wrought iron objects for the lodge. Many are in the spirit of the original, but were never at the lodge. For example, he created, with other blacksmiths, handrails that look as though they were original to the lodge, but never were in the lodge to begin with, but they help the lodge meet some of ADA requirements or some accessibility requirements. And it has been a wonderful restoration project to see this chain of craftsmen continue to the present. Wood. Ray Newford was the supervisor of the woodworking shop, and he said about workers like the one in the photo on the right, most of the men came in from construction projects and they didn't know they could do some of the things they did. Most of them had been out of work for a long time, then on construction jobs, and they had lost their self-confidence. Newford created a special wood chair with arms to be built over the weekend prior to President Roosevelt's dedication. It may have been used by the president when he sat at lunch in the lodge, and making that chair was something he always remembered. In fact, he made several replicas of it later in his life. Both Dawson and Newford remembered that terrific rush to have the lodge ready in time for the dedication. And they always remembered, as many of the workers did, that Timberline was one of the peak experiences of their work lives. As furniture is worn out, chairs and tables have been recreated in the same or similar styles. Twin and double beds have been replaced with queen-size ones to meet current guest room requirements. President Roosevelt came to Oregon to dedicate Bonneville Dam, and he agreed to motor around to Mount Hood to dedicate the lodge on September 28, 1937. This photo shows the motorcade as it moved along the Columbia River Highway away from Bonneville Dam on its way to Timberline. At the entrance to the National Forest, mounted Forest Service personnel greeted the travelers. They had to pass over a bridge on their way up to the lodge, and our engineer, Ward Gano, was assigned the job of watching the bridge. I suppose it was felt that my being under the bridge would discourage anyone having any thoughts about blowing it up. I had no weapon of any kind to back up my mere presence. As I sat out of sight under the bridge, I heard cars and the president's party rumble across its plank deck. He went on up and was present at the lodge for the dedication, and then he went back down and was under the bridge when the party went back down. Yeah. Not being a member of the press, George Henderson, who took the photo on the left, missed the press briefing where instructions were given not to photograph the president as he was being assisted from his car. As George pressed his finger on the shutter, a Secret Service man pointed at him and said, "Don't take that picture." But by then, all George could do was release his finger. Roosevelt made his way up a specially built ramp that was boarded on the side so that people couldn't see how much assistance he received as he was ushered up the ramp into the lodge. He went up the elevator that had been installed to the first floor and came out on the terrace facing south to give his dedication address. Governor Charles Martin's introduction was very brief. He said, "The President of the United States." Roosevelt began, "Here I am on the slopes of Mount Hood, where I have always wanted to come." He read the words on the tablet that was on the terrace, it's still there, dedicating the lodge to the workers who built it. And he gave a short speech pointing out the economic significance of the timber resources to the American people, but also the importance of year-round recreation and the future that Mount Hood and Timberline would play. He concluded, "So I take very great pleasure in dedicating this lodge not only as a new adjunct of our national forests, but also as a place to play for generations of Americans in the days to come." After the speech, the presidential party ate lunch, looked around briefly, and left for the train station in Portland. And on their way back, they slowly passed the CCC camp that was at Zigzag, where all the enrollees were standing out. So the lodge was not ready to open when it was dedicated, and interior furnishing continued through the fall. It opened on February 4th and 5th of 1938 in a snowstorm that reportedly trapped some journalists. It had been designed, built, and furnished between December of 1935 and February of 1938. The Magic Mile chairlift was built the next year on the east side of the lodge. Its terminus was Silcock's Hut, named after Ferdinand Silcox, chief of the Forest Service, who was instrumental in supporting construction of the lift before he died. The WPA funded construction of both the lift and Silcock's Hut. Prince Olaf and Princess Martha of Norway dedicated it with chrome-plated nut and bolt prior to its construction. The Portland businessmen who had provided seed money for the lodge construction formed a corporation, Timberline Lodge, Inc., that became the first operator of the lodge and ski area and continued under different ownership until 1955, when the current RLK and Company assumed the operation. So this brief history of Timberline shows how integral Timberline was to the WPA in Oregon. Most programs of the WPA seem to participate in its construction, furnishing, decoration, and entertainment. Timberline exemplified what each of the programs was capable of producing. The lodge is now 80 years old, and it still reflects the original vision of the builders. Journalist Leverett Richards expressed the feelings of many in an article in the Oregonian published on January 23rd of 1955. "Nowhere has man come closer to improving on nature with nature's own stone and timber than in Timberline Lodge. The spirit of Mount Hood, the nation's most climbed, most explored, most loved mountain, is embodied in the lodge." The heart of Oregon went into this unique edifice. It was conceived by the people of Oregon, built by the hands of the people, for the perpetual enjoyment of the people. Thank you.